Awesome. Welcome, everyone. I think this is the second last session. We're almost there. We're almost at the end, making it through. So first, I'll bring up our first presenter. So Dr. Doug Beirness, and recent award winner as well, has spent his entire professional career doing research in the area of alcohol and drug-impaired driving. His educational background includes a Master of Science in addiction studies and a PhD in psychology, specializing in behavioral pharmacology. He currently serves as a senior research associate with the Canadian Centre of Substance Abuse and Addiction, and is president of Beirness and Associates and the director of the Canadian Drug and Alcohol Research Team. He has served on numerous working groups and committees, including Transportation Research Board Standing Committee on Alcohol, Drugs, and Transportation, including a term as chair, Canadian Society of Forensic Science, Drugs, and Driving Committee, including a term as vice chair, and the Canadian Association of Road Safety Professionals, currently vice president. Dr. Beirness has been recognized by the International Association of Chiefs of Police Drug Recognition Expert section as a DRE ambassador, and is the recipient of the Hayden Award from the International Council on Alcohol, Drugs, and Traffic Safety. In 2021, he was presented with the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Canadian Association of Road Safety Professionals. Floor is all yours, Doug.
So I'm going to talk about mandatory alcohol screening today. We heard some of the presenters this morning talk about mandatory alcohol screening, and I'm just going to give you my thoughts on this. But before I start, how many people flew to the conference? We got a few. How many have been on a commercial airline in the past 20 years? What's your favorite part about flying? Getting there, right? What's the least favorite part of the whole flying experience? The waiting. Security. I hate security. Drives me crazy. You stand in line for what seems like hours only to get your carry-on bag that you've carefully packed and unpack it. You take off your jacket, your boots, which you've selected particularly because they're comfortable on an airplane, and put them on several. You take out all that stuff. And then if you've left a dime in your pocket, you get the special treatment. If you're really lucky, you get to go through the whole body scanner. That's really special. I don't know about you, but whenever I go through one of those, this shoulder, they always want to check it out. I don't know why. There's nothing wrong with that shoulder. It's all original parts. It's just a special experience. And what makes it even more special is the fact that if you look at your airplane ticket where you've paid for it, you pay for that privilege separately. There's an extra charge on your ticket just for the privilege of going through security. I just had to get that through. Oh, I'm sorry. We got to do it this way. So this morning, James talked a little bit about mandatory alcohol screening in Canada, which adds on to one of the tools that the police have to be able to detect alcohol among drivers. And this is the section that's there now, but it's essentially the old section of the law that says you have to have suspicion. Every time I reword the legal part and say it has a reasonable suspicion that the driver has been drinking, I get in trouble with the lawyers because they say, no, it's not had been drinking, it has alcohol in their body. To which I respond, how the hell do you think it got there? There are other ways. They're messy, they're inconvenient, and they're actually very inefficient. But you can look up on YouTube on how to do that if you so choose. The new section is mandatory alcohol screening. And we talked about this morning, so I'm not going to dwell on. Basically, an officer can demand a breath test of anyone in the absence of suspicion. Why? Why was it so important to include mandatory alcohol screening? Parliament has tried a couple of times to get mandatory alcohol screening into the criminal code. It didn't make it the first time. The second time it did. And the reason is we've been doing a good job with alcohol impaired driving over the years, but we're not there yet. It's still a big problem. If you look at the Justice or Statistics Canada data on reported incidents, there are over 70,000 a year for the last several years. And in fact, right now we're going in the wrong direction again, apparently. If you use the survey data that from Health Canada, their alcohol use data, and reported driving after alcohol use data, you can estimate that there's between 6 and 11 million trips involving a drinking driver every year in Canada. That's a lot. We need to find a better way. We can't expect the police to identify 11 million drinking drivers on the road. So let's have a look at what the role of the police actually is. Well, first, the obvious one that we all know about is to identify those drinking drivers and remove those who have had too much to drink from the road, who are causing an increase in risk. That's the specific deterrence element of this. You identify the drivers and ensure that they're punished. Well, the best you can anyway. But the other role of the police is not so obvious, and that's general deterrence. They're out there to serve as a deterrent to other drivers who might consider engaging in the behavior by increasing their perception as well as the actual probability of being caught. That's general deterrence. This is where mandatory alcohol screening comes in. Now, the other reason we want mandatory alcohol screening is because alcohol detection is actually very difficult. Oh, you can smell alcohol, you can see the symptoms. I mean, but everybody can spot a drunk. They're not hard. It's the drivers who have lower levels of alcohol. That's where it becomes difficult. The physical symptoms, the typical ones, the bloodshot or glassy eyes, the fumbling, the slurred speech, that kind of stuff, that's okay. But those symptoms are dose dependent. A lot of them depend on a very high dose of alcohol. And we've said a lot about tolerance when it comes to cannabis. Oh yeah, I can drive after cannabis because I'm tolerant. The one drug that we know causes tolerance to occur very quickly is alcohol. But we never talk about drivers who are tolerant to alcohol. We use blood alcohol concentration. I don't care if you're tolerant or not. If you're over 80, you're over 80. One of the signs and symptoms that's commonly used to identify drinking drivers is your sense of smell. Well, actually, ethyl alcohol has very little odor. It's clear, it's colorless, and it just doesn't smell particularly well. What you're actually smelling are the congeners and the flavorings that are added to the beverage or produced in the making of the beverage itself. And smell is also dose dependent. The more you drink, the more likely you are to smell like alcohol or what we think is alcohol. So using smell from a psychometric perspective has high sensitivity but low specificity. And what that means is if you smell alcohol or think you smell alcohol, you're probably right. The person has probably been drinking. But if you don't smell alcohol, you know nothing. You could be right, you could be wrong. It's got low specificity. So it's not exactly the best indicator that we have when we want to detect drivers who have been drinking. It's a tough job. There's actually several studies out there. I've listed 3 here in case you're interested. There are others. The reason I picked these 3 to talk about, I'm not going to talk about studies. because go all the way back to 1932. Widmark, those of you who study alcohol know Widmark. He's the granddaddy, the great granddaddy of alcohol studies. He used physicians to assess drivers who had been arrested for impaired driving. Those physicians failed to detect alcohol in 37% of drivers who had been arrested for drunk driving. Moskowitz, those of you who study alcohol know Herb Moskowitz as well. Unique study, dosed people up, had them blow through a straw through on the other side of an opaque curtain, had police officers just smell the breath coming through the straw and tried to determine what their blood alcohol concentration was. Up to half of them missed people who had a blood alcohol concentration over 80. The study that I really like, because I was there for it, was one by Wells, where a checkpoint was operational in North Carolina prior to a roadside survey. The police demanded that they have the opportunity to pull out the impaired drivers before they got to the survey, which kind of defeats the purpose as far as I was concerned. But turns out the police officers who were doing the checkpoint weren't very good at it. Despite the fact that they just don't ask the driver if they've been drinking. They had to see their driver's license, their vehicle registration. They had to see the sticker on the windshield that said the vehicle had been recently inspected. And they asked them if there were any weapons in the vehicle. I never saw so many guns in my whole life. And typically what they do is they take the gun out, empty the shells out of it, and give it back to the driver. In the police checkpoint, 62% of drivers with a BAC over 80 were missed by the officers. So what we're seeing is that even though drivers are being stopped in an alcohol checkpoint, they're getting through, even though they have high BAC levels. So we need a new approach. That's where general deterrence comes in. I like to think of general deterrence as what prevention is to public health. Over the last couple of years, we've talked a lot about preventing COVID. Why? Because we can't treat everyone who gets COVID. We just about overran the hospital system as it was. We just can't treat that number of people. The same with when it comes to impaired driving. We can't arrest 11 million drivers every year. It's just not possible. What we need to do is prevent the behavior in the first place. We could do more checkpoints. That works. Lots of studies that show if you do more checkpoints, you can see a reduction in alcohol-related crashes. But what we really need is better detection techniques. And one of those techniques that has been tried and is actually used in some US states are passive alcohol sensors. This is essentially it's an ASD in a stick that you just kind of sort of hold in front of the driver and capture some of the air being exhaled from the driver to see if there's any alcohol in it. It was tried here in Canada. It didn't really go over very well, but it's a possibility. Did I miss one there? So mandatory alcohol screening enters the picture. The purpose is to increase the perceived as well as the actual probability that drinking drivers will be detected and ultimately sanctioned for the behavior. MASS is used in numerous countries around the world. The Australians are probably the most famous for it. They did it in a very big way. But New Zealand, a lot of countries in the EU, Ireland, Scandinavia, they all use mandatory alcohol screening. When you're stopped, you're required to give a breath sample. There's nothing new and novel about it, except here in Canada. There are, in fact, numerous studies to show that mandatory alcohol screening works. The evidence that I like to refer to when I'm asked about this are the studies from Australia, because they've done a lot of them. And there's some very good studies that have been done. Now, are they perfect? No. Do they provide some pretty good evidence? You betcha. And what those studies show is that they see a reduction in serious and fatal crashes anywhere from 19 to 48%. That's huge. That's a huge reduction in crashes. Here in Canada, when mandatory alcohol screening first came in 2018, December 2018, I was asked to do a little study for Justice Canada, and we needed some data. So we asked some of the provincial reps from CCMTA to see if they could give us some preliminary data on alcohol-related fatalities over the last several years. And we did indeed get data from some of these jurisdictions. And this is what we were able to find. Now, these are preliminary data. They're by no means final. They're not definitive. But just with these preliminary data, we saw a 6% reduction in non-impaired driver fatalities, but a 39% reduction in impaired driver fatalities. Again, that's not definitive, but it sure points in the right direction. It's exactly what we thought we might see in terms of reducing fatalities. The other data we were able to look at is data from the city of Edmonton. These data were captured by Detective Rob Davis and their checkpoints. They kept track of the number of checkpoints they did, the number of vehicles, the number of screening tests they did, and enforcement actions. As you can see in the fourth column there, the first yellow column, the most important thing that they did was they checked more drivers. They checked 12% of drivers with an ASD prior to a mandatory alcohol screening, but almost 100% thereafter. They're testing more drivers. Enforcement actions includes a whole bunch of things, including graduated licensing suspensions, administrative suspensions, and criminal charges. We saw that per vehicle check, the numbers went up. That's a statistically significant difference. But interestingly, the number of suspended drivers who were identified in checkpoints did not change. So it's not just that everything changed as a result of mandatory alcohol screening. The only thing that changed was the alcohol-related part. Are there concerns about mass? You betcha. Is this a fundamental paradigm shift that requires considerable scrutiny? Is this so different that we need to look at this very closely, not only from a research perspective, but from a legal perspective? Or is this simply a shift from reliance on our sensory and observational capabilities in detecting alcohol to a more technological approach, using equipment that the police already have, already know how to use? So we're not just sniffing around and trying to find those observational clues, but just using the ASD that they already have. From a legal perspective, does it infringe on our constitutional right to be secure against unreasonable search and seizure? That's bigger than you think it is. Or does it help to ensure our expectation to be safe on our roads, safe from the risk posed by impaired drivers? Those are the questions that will ultimately be answered by the courts. As James said, eventually we'll probably get to the Supreme Court on this one, but it's going to take us a while. Meanwhile, we're going forward with this. So just in closing, I want to go back to where I started. Nobody likes airport screening. Is it infringing on our rights? Is it against the right to against unreasonable search and seizure? They're going through your personal stuff, looking for stuff just in case you're doing something wrong. Why do we tolerate it? Because we also expect that our airlines will be safe. Despite the fact that there has never been a documented case of an airline in Canada being brought down by somebody bringing something on the plane that caused it to crash, we tolerate this because we want to be safe and secure against the possibility of harm. Something to think about. And I'm going to leave you with that because I don't have the answer. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Doug. Does anyone have any questions? Nope, perfectly clear.
That's fine, because I would just refer them back to James.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. In lieu of a speaker gift, every presenter has had a donation made in their name to the Young Professionals Committee. Perfect. So we can have our next presenter. Robert, you're next, right?
Robert, just need to change the mouse.
Perfect. So our next speaker is Robert Colonna. Robert is a third-year PhD candidate in health promotion at Western University. He is a project coordinator in the iMobile Driving Research Lab at Western and a research assistant at the Public Health Agency of Canada. Robert's research focuses on improving public health through road safety interventions, specifically those related to youth cannabis use and impaired driving. He is involved in many research and leadership initiatives within the road safety community. He is on the board of directors for the Canadian Association of Road Safety Professionals and is the current chair of the Young Professionals Committee. He is also a co-investigator in 2 national funded studies investigating the determinants of cannabis impaired driving among youth and examining how social media portrays and reacts to cannabis impaired driving content. Robert, the floor is yours.
Ready? Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you everyone. Thanks for the introduction. So in today's presentation, I want to talk to you about the impact of cannabis on the driving performance of youth. And findings are going to be from a systematic literature review that we conducted. Now the review is published, so you can take a look at it over there. The point of today's presentation is to provide more of a general overview. Okay, so in Canada, cannabis is one of the most commonly used psychoactive substances, and it's pretty much most commonly used among youth. Now, there's a growing body of literature showing that cannabis has several negative effects on young people, including on their physical and mental health, their cognitive ability, their development, and then their ability to operate a motor vehicle. Now, over the past few decades, this is concerning, right? Driving under the influence of cannabis has been increasing. It's been increasingly reported among young drivers and increasingly being tested and detected among those involved in a collision. Now, the psychoactive component in cannabis, THC, is proven to impair the driving performance and increase the risk of collisions among young drivers. And today I want to talk to you about how it actually impairs driving performance. It's also worth noting that young drivers have one of the highest risks for collisions. This is due to their inexperience, their immaturity, their risk-taking behaviors. And recent literature really shows that they lack concern towards driving under the influence of cannabis. So knowing if cannabis affects driving and how it affects driving is important for preventative efforts. Okay, so just a few quick clarifications before we get into some of the findings. There's 2 main types of studies to assess traffic safety, and many of you know this already. There's observational studies, right? These use drivers as cases. They assess if those who have used cannabis are overrepresented in collision statistics than those who don't use cannabis. Now, these can include case control studies, case crossover, cohort studies, etc. And some of the best evidence right now, reviewing these studies and meta-analyzing them, shows that there's an approximately 30 to 40% increased risk of collisions from cannabis or THC. So we know that cannabis increases collision risk. What we don't know is how it affects driving, and that's what I kind of want to answer today. And this is where the experimental studies come in. These are those that will actually administer cannabis to drivers and then test them using a simulator or an on-road test. And then just one quick other clarification between the terms fitness to drive and then driving performance. Just note that these are 2 different terms. Fitness to drive more so assesses your physical and mental ability to drive on the road, keep up with the flow of traffic. And this is best used an on-road test, so a comprehensive driving evaluation. Now, unfortunately, we can't just give people cannabis and put them on the road and test them. There's ethical and safety implications with that. So driving performance is another term we use. This focuses more on the physical, the mental, the skills, the behaviors, the habits, right, of drivers. And this can be assessed using a driving simulator. Now, driving simulators are great. They provide more of a safe and controlled environment, and they're pretty sensitive to the effects of cannabis on driving. So you're going to see today that most of the studies I'm going to talk about are driving simulator studies. And just note that you really need both types of studies to have a concrete kind of conclusion on how cannabis affects driving. Okay, so the objective of the review was to determine the quality of evidence on the effects of cannabis on the driving performance of youth, and then determine the level of confidence in the individual outcomes that we're going to look at, and I'll discuss these. So we conducted a systematic literature review. It was a team of 8 researchers. We looked at 7 databases up until March 1st, 2020. So just note that there are newer studies coming out. This is kind of the studies that were included in the review that I'm going to present. And the keywords focused on automobile driving and then cannabis. So automobile driving included terms like car, vehicle, driving performance, fitness of drive, etc. And then cannabis, marijuana, THC, pot, hash, and so on. Studies were included if they were published in English, if they were peer-reviewed quantitative studies, if they had an on-road assessment or a driving simulator task, if they included young drivers. So we kind of operationalize that as with a mean under 26 years, and if they reported primary driving performance outcomes. So studies that were not published in English, studies that were gray literature, and those that didn't isolate for the effects of cannabis on driving were excluded. The guidelines we use for critical appraisal are the American Academy of Neurology guidelines, and these have been used in previous evidence-based reviews for driving safety, so we decided to adapt them for this study. Basically, we first start by classifying the evidence. This is more so on internal validity concerns, so the research design, the sample size, randomization, allocation, concealment, intention to treat analysis, and etc. And just know that class 1 means the highest quality of evidence, and then class 4 is the lowest quality. Then we sought to, based on the guidelines, determine the level of confidence, and the level of confidence is in the individual driving performance outcomes, and level of confidence is based on the quality of evidence and the number of studies that are higher or lower quality. So this is a quick chart just kind of explaining that. This is first looking at the class of evidence. So you see class 1, which is the best quality, has the lowest risk of bias, right? So an RCT, meeting a number of different conditions, and the list goes on. So I'm not going to go through all this. And then, as I mentioned, the second step was determining the level of confidence, right? So if you have 2 or more class 1 studies, so low risk of bias studies, then we're going to have high confidence in the outcome. And this was looked at each individual outcome. Okay, so we identified about 1,700 articles through the search. Once we did the title and abstract in the second level screening, we ended up with 13 articles, and they were included in a kind of qualitative synthesis. We did not do meta-analysis just due to kind of heterogeneity among results. The mean result was 23.5 years, and 63% of the sample were males. Countries varied between the US, Canada, Australia, Israel, Germany, and Netherlands. 12 of the studies used a driving simulator, and then one of them reported both a driving simulator and an on-road test. That study was Netherlands that did the on-road test. 8 of them had a fixed base simulator. So this means when you're driving the driving simulator, you're not actually moving. It's like being in a chair like this. And then 5 of them had a motion simulator. And this means that when you're driving, you might get haptic feedback. The steering wheel might move, the chair might move if you're braking, a little bit more like immersed experience. The scenario times did range between 6 and 45 minutes. Some of them were conducted on rural roads, a few on urban sections, and then a few on highway. And the THC concentration really did range. So the studies that reported milligrams, that ranged from 1.3 to 23 milligrams, and studies that reported THC percentages ranged from 2% to 13%. Now it's worth noting 2 studies did not administer THC. They tested the presence of THC kind of metabolites of cannabis, so of a driver that had used cannabis. Okay, so there were several outcomes reported across the studies. This is just a chart showing all of them. So speed, deviation of lane position, etc. I'm going to go over some of the more important ones. Okay, so I also changed the presentation up a little bit. I wanted to make this a little more interactive. Sometimes I'll do this when I'm presenting this to students or kind of people at university. So what we're going to do is I'm going to describe each of the outcomes, and then I want you to put your hand up. So give me a thumbs up if you think it's going to increase the outcome. So if THC is going to increase, for example, mean speed, put your thumb down if you think THC will decrease mean speed. Okay, so mean speed is basically the speed you're driving, right? So if you're driving faster or slower. Let me see, thumbs up or thumbs down? Okay, so we have majority thumbs down, a few thumbs up. So THC, based on evidence from 1 class 1 study and 5 class 2 studies, decreases mean speed. Next is reaction time. So think of reaction times as the time it takes you to hit the brake when you see a hazard. So the lower the reaction time, the better, right? The higher the reaction time, the worse. So do you think THC will increase the time it takes you to react to see a hazard or decrease it? Just increase. Okay, there's a bit of a mix. 2 people not showing. Let's see. What do you think? Just take a guess. Increase. Okay. So THC will increase your reaction time. So it takes you longer to identify a hazard and then brake. Headway distance and following distance. This is the distance between you and the car in front of you. So think of it as if you have a low following distance, you're tailgating. If you have a large following distance, you're following really far behind. So do you think that THC would increase or decrease the following distance of the driver? This is very mixed again. This is great to see. So based on evidence from 2 class 2 studies, we have moderate confidence that THC increases the following distance. So you're actually following back a little bit further. Deviation of lane position. So this is basically, think of someone driving straight. If you're deviating, if you're veering more to one side or the other. So do you think THC increases the deviation? So more veering to the sides, or decreases it? Okay, this is an easy one, yeah. So based on evidence from 1 class 1 study and 5 class 2 studies, THC increases your lane position deviation. Next one is steering wheel position variability. This is a little bit similar to the last one. The way I like to think of it is you can be driving straight, and I'm going to do this so everyone can see, and have the wheel steady, or you can be driving straight and have the wheel like this, but you're still going straight, right? So it's the deviation of the steering wheel moving, and it's assessed using the simulator. So do you think THC increases or decreases your steering wheel position variability? Oh, this is mixed. Okay, there's a few increases, few decreases. So THC increases your steering wheel position variability based on 3 class 2 studies, meaning that the steering wheel moves a little bit more. Okay, collision and crash risk. So do you think that THC increases or decreases collision risk? Okay, I see all thumbs up. This is actually a little bit of a trick one I made, because unfortunately we don't have enough evidence based on the simulator studies to show that THC has an increase or decrease. Now, just one thing to note, based on the observational studies, there's clear evidence that THC, you're more likely to be in a collision if you're on THC, right? But based on the driving simulator evidence with young drivers and the ones studies identified in our review, there's insufficient evidence for that. Okay, so this is just reiterating what I just said, showing if it increases or decreases each of the driving outcomes. And this is a demonstration. This is how a normal car drives. So going straight. This is how someone who's on cannabis might drive. So you see they're driving a little bit slower. They have greater following distance, so they're following back. Greater lane position variability and steering wheel variability. Increased reaction time. And based on the observational evidence, increased collision risk. Now, I also wanted to show kind of how cannabis compares to alcohol. And the reason for this, this was not included in the review. So there's not really data in our review showing this, but a lot of youth rationalize driving high, saying that it's safer than drinking and driving. So I wanted to show a quick diagram of how they might differ. So you see with alcohol, usually your speed is increased, your following distance is actually decreased, so you're more likely to tailgate. Both with alcohol and cannabis, you're going to have increased lane position variability, increased steering variability, increased reaction times, and both increase collision risk. Okay, just a few quick conclusions. So based on the review that we've conducted, cannabis likely decreases mean speed and headway distance. It increases the deviation of lane position, deviation of steering wheel position, and then reaction times. This is all among young drivers. However, there is an overall moderate risk of bias among the evidence, and therefore we only have moderate confidence in the level of evidence for each of these outcomes. So it really does show that we need more studies. We need more class 1 studies, like those RCTs that are large. We need on-road studies, right? Once we're able to conduct those properly. And we also need some more female and gender diverse representation. This doesn't necessarily mean it's a class 1 or 2. This is just showing that in our review, all the studies identified just kind of had a male or female, like dichotomized gender. So we want to see a little bit more of that. So thank you for listening to the presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. Are there any questions for Robert? Oh, here, I'm going to get up and walk to you just so I can get some steps in.
That was a great presentation, Robert. Thank you. When I look at driving performance and driving behavior, I actually draw a distinction between the two. So for me, driver behavior is a way that you choose to drive. And performance, in my mind, is do you have the ability to drive a particular task or a particular skill, demonstrate a particular skill? And so when we do our driving simulation studies, we can sort of choose instructions that either focus on behavior or that focus on performance. So for example, we might say, drive as you normally would. And so that's kind of a behavior set of instructions. We're looking to see what they'll do versus we say, well, the speed limit's 80 kilometers. We want you to stick to that speed. And again, are they able to perform the 80 kilometer set of instructions? And I was wondering if in your review, you had looked to see what studies are doing. So are they really focusing on behavior or are they focusing on performance? And does that change what results you see?
That's an amazing question. No, unfortunately, like I don't recall if we look specifically at that. We conducted the review a while ago, so I don't recall it. We might have done it. I'll have to take a look, and then maybe we can chat about that after.
I'm just
Yeah.
interested because it's something that sort of came up in our lab, and
And
so we've done studies doing one and doing the other, and we do get different results.
That's interesting. That's something I'm going to look at a little bit more in the future. I know we're doing one study using a driving simulator with a different population, and we say drive as you normally would. And sometimes it's interesting to see how people drive. Any other questions? Doctor?
I know we hear a lot from the experimental studies that people who have been using cannabis drive slower. But when you look at the drug recognition expert evaluations, the first thing that comes out is the reason that they were stopped is speeding. And I'm just wondering whether that's got to do with what Christine was talking about versus someone who's in a simulator and doing the best they can because they're being watched.
That is a great point. I've heard of that too, right? Usually on road, they're driving faster. And I think that's something that we really need more of those on-road studies to help test this, because the simulator is a controlled, safer environment, right? We try to replicate the on-road conditions, but you can't do 100%. And one thing I didn't really mention in this presentation, but sometimes on a simulator, depending on how kind of interactive it is, you can get simulator sickness, right? And that's a phenomenon that usually if people have a simulator sickness, they're actually going to drive slower. So that's something you have to kind of look at in studies too, is the effect of this from potential motion sickness or simulator sickness or from THC. And in our review, some of the studies didn't report that. So we didn't actually reach out to authors. We just kind of reported what was published in the literature. But I think a more kind of comprehensive review is going to have to explore that too.
Thank you. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Awesome. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you.
This one has been.
Thank you. So now I'll introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Ilan Nachim. He is the founder of Bridges Medical Clinic, a virtual practice specializing in the practice of longitudinal interdisciplinary, made this difficult, interdisciplinary addiction medicine, which serves individuals across Ontario. He is trained in family medicine with a certification of added competence in addiction medicine. He is the former medical director of Bellwood Health Services, a residential treatment center in Toronto, and co-founder of Vector Medical, which provides medical assessments for employees with substance use disorders. In 2019, Dr. Nachim helped found CanSite, which has contributed technological solutions to the field of impairment detection. Okay, floor is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so as we've been hearing throughout the day and different presentations, obviously substance is a significant issue in terms of regards to driving, and the current standard of testing is with a DRE, right? The drug recognition testing expert. And that's when we started looking into, I've been working into addiction medicine and in this field of trying to identify workers and when they're safe to go back to work and with regards to impairment. And when we were looking at different technologies and exploring ways as to how to use technologies to benefit that industry, we decided to start from the gold standard, right? In the how does the industry right now determine what's considered impairment in the real world? And it was through the drug recognition expert testing that we started as our when we created our technology, our device. And the issues obviously that's been mentioned in different presentations today is the significant lack of resources, right? Both from a spatial geographical aspect, but also from a resource aspect, right? We know there's more funding being invested for training of officers, but still it's quite limited. And obviously, there's a significant risk to the population, right? We know through a lot of statistics that I'm sure some of the people in this room have conducted some of these trials in the past. And that this was sort of the basis for our device that we created. And just a quick recap with regards to the actual, for some people that are not aware, the testing parameters that go into a drug recognition evaluation. There's 12 of them. It's a standardized test. It's been used. It's right. It's been validated. And the numbers 4 through 8 are the ones that require pretty significant testing because they're more subtle, and I think this is where a lot of the training goes into with regards to training a police officer to be able to detect the impairment. So it requires some more knowledge about neurology and sort of the body, how the neurophysiology works. And these are the ones that we sort of looked at the machine could replicate quite well, or we could use technology to conduct some of that. So we created a device that sort of looks like it's a desktop device at the moment. And it has both an operator station on the side here, and the main screen is where the testing is conducted. And it has different tools that can do different types of analysis. So we have we can do eye analyzing different eye movements. We can do walking tests and turns and different types of tests, and also the biophysical. We integrated with blood pressure machines and muscle tone devices in order to acquire all the necessary information required for a DRE exam. And this is something that can be done remotely, and and virtual. It can be recorded. It can be used in the courts if necessary. And so we set off. So this is our product, and this is just sort of our prototype that we created here. And I think this was the key point, is that it can be used in remote operations in real time, anywhere in Canada or in the world, really. And we created a trial a couple of years. This was right before COVID, where we tried to get a proof of concept trial. We recruited 12 subjects and divided into 2 different groups. We chose to use cannabis and alcohol. I think the alcohol because it's what the DRE has been traditionally used for, and cannabis because I think we're all struggling to figure out how do we determine impairment from cannabis levels, right? That's one of the challenges that we don't have good answers for yet. So we before our subjects were tested, we used oral fluid swab tester and breathalyzer to detect if there was any baseline substances in their bodies and alcohol. And once the trial started with subjects, they either drank alcohol or smoked cannabis to achieve an estimated blood alcohol levels that was above the legal limit. And so for the trials, we had a total of 48 assessments that were done under a medical doctor, and we had a DRE present who conducted the tests. So each subject, they were tested 4 times for impairment. So they had a baseline pre-drinking or smoking, depending which group they were assigned to, and by an in-person DRE, right? So this is the gold standard. And then they had, after they smoked or drank, they had a post testing done. And then we had, in addition, the baseline pre-drinking smoking test by our device, and then post-drinking smoking test by the device after that. So to present the results, we had all our subjects achieve the targeted levels, right, by using the devices that we tested. According to results, so 83% of alcohol subjects were determined to be impaired by both the in-person and DRE and by our device. And all the cannabis patients, there's 33 of them, were considered to be impaired by the DRE and by device, right? So it was much less. Even though all the cannabis subjects reported that they felt high at that time, more than 80% of them would answer if they would drive, based on how they felt. So one interesting thing is that one of the subjects actually showed a positive test for cannabis prior to this test, suggesting that they were a chronic user. And the baseline testing, that person did not show an impairment. But after smoking, he did fail the testing, and this was confirmed by the physicians as well. So in line, just to sort of present some of the discussion. So in line with the previous literature that's been reported, there's no real linear correlation between the THC levels or an actual mental psychomotor impairment levels, right? And that's why there's a challenge in this area. And we know, based on how our subjects report and based on literature, a lot of times when people don't feel high or they feel impaired, despite them showing impairment. So our results did show that our device matched 100% with the findings of the DRE, and that's the takeaway message from what we set out to do, is that our device is comparable to and provides the same level of accuracy. It's a proof of concept. Obviously, it's a small a number of subjects, but it set out to do exactly what we wanted and we were hoping. And this is potentially a reliable alternative to some of the challenges that we have right now, right? Because we're training a lot of police officers, spending millions in doing that, and yet there could be other solutions that we should probably be exploring to help us make the road safer. And I think the applications of this technology could be especially useful in the smaller communities, right, where they maybe have more difficulty getting access to a DRE, especially in the middle of the night, right? So you can have a device set up in a centralized area, and information can be relayed securely to a DRE who can evaluate the situation, and this can be recorded as well for the purpose of court submission. And I think the interesting direction. So besides this application, this could also be have a lot of other applications. I think down the road we're looking at once you have enough data, you can look at machine learning protocols to identify specific parameters or certain eye movements that can be correlated to specific substances, and also create specific protocols that would be valid to be used in a much faster way, right? We know the DRE test can take 40 minutes, so it's very time consuming right now. So if we can find a solution to that as well, to that will be validated. This is obviously down the road, but for now we've this is sort of what we've at the moment what we visualize is that we have potentially a remote device that can be used roadside, and it can be served as a screening tool. And then if necessary, we can have the more detailed exam, right? So that's and this is our device site one, we called it, and a potential sort of diagram that would as an option as to how to manage the situation, right? If with regards to the roadside screening, that we would have a roadside unit for which it can be detected, and you can have an officer that's remote and ideally receive information live that would be able to help determine the next steps. So this was our first time presenting at the project or what we've worked on. So happy to take any questions, and thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Are there any? Oh, got one back there.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one more thing. We're part of us coming here is obviously to identify people who'd be interested in this and make connections and partners. So if any agencies or anyone would be interested in sort of speaking, we'd be happy to connect after the presentations.
Thank you. I think that was such an incredible presentation and such an advancement in technology, and it was just so incredible to see. One of the challenges that some individuals face, particularly minorities, when being faced with police, is a lot of fear, and it can help with them demonstrating signs of impairment when they're not actually impaired. How does this technology kind of mitigate that?
I think sort of, it's a good question. And I think as part of the, when this is ready to be launched, I think user experience is going to be a significant part of it. We'd probably be consulting with the appropriate people to ensure that people would be comfortable, because it could be scary, right? You have to put, the way we created the device in order to achieve similarity in the testing, to the standards testing. We created a box that people have to put their faces inside, right? So it's dark, and they have to follow these lights, right? And the camera records the eye movements. So for someone who's already scared to be in such a situation, that could be create even more fear. So it's a valid question. I think this is for anyone that does DRE sort of type of work, I think this is definitely something you'd consult in order to mitigate that risk. I think that whole experience of having someone go through a testing, whether it's with a police officer or a DRE officer, it's scary to begin with, but it's something that will definitely have to be mitigated in the future.
Thank you.
Any other quote right here?
As a DRE, I now know how cashiers feel about the initiation of automatic checkouts. I could probably spend 20 minutes here asking you questions, but I'll try to keep them specific. Now, I see you did alcohol and cannabis. Now, I understand what you say. You have them look in there with the eyes, but that's great for somebody who's maybe at a low level, who can stand up, who can follow instructions. But I'd be interested to see how somebody from using multiple drugs, on the nod from an opioid would perform given the capabilities of the device. The other thing with respect to poly drug use is there's so many factors beyond just those measuring those clinical indicators that a DRE does with respect to behavior, speech patterns, just things like that that help you make that determination between those poly drugs that I think technology would have a hard time measuring. And the other kind of problem I foresee with it is it's very simple for me to go to court and testify on my abilities and what I saw. That doesn't require calibration, maintenance records, all of those type of things, which could definitely be a factor for using more technology to measure this. So those are just kind of comments with respect to that. But for the cannabis use, again, when you have tolerance and much different ways to measure it, I'd be interested to see with higher concentrations of cannabis, how the ability would act under those. And have you considered, I guess, testing the device with polydrug use and higher doses?
So there's a lot of questions there. I'll try to sort of address a couple of the points and be happy to speak with you offline as well. I think sort of as a clinician, I appreciate what you're saying in terms of there's something about, when you have a person in front of you and see how they behave. We've considered that. And I think, I've been doing telemedicine for the last 2 years of COVID, and I found that I've been able to get a pretty good sense over time of what someone looks like on camera. And if you have a good recording device, good internet, good connection. And I think that, this device would record, that interaction, right? The DRE would be able to, has the ability to converse with the person in real time if they need to. So, is it perfect? Maybe, probably not. Probably it's not the same as being in person. But the idea is not to replace the DRE or anything like that. This device is meant to assist and to provide additional information, right? Because a lot of this information will be recorded. It's something that I think can reinforce and can provide additional support to DREs rather than sort of maybe in 20, 30 years down the road, who knows? But at least sort of when right now as you create the device, it's really to assist and to help smaller communities that don't have access at this present time. With regards to substance use and I think it's a challenge that exists. I'm not a DRE, so I'm speaking more of the clinician. But I think that this test, there is improvement, and I think there's new outcomes that I believe are being investigated that could be more specific to individual substances. And I think that would be neat if we get to that stage where certain features or perhaps new testing will be available that's going to complement and allow us to specifically identify which substance someone is impaired to, rather than sort of have a general. But impairment's impairment, right? Whether it's because you didn't sleep all the night before, or whether it's a substance or whatever it is. I think these are the challenges that a machine faces today or faces, and a person will face in determining that. So obviously it's early on. I think there's a lot of work to be done. So I'm thank you for your feedback, because I think this is what we're trying to figure out is what needs to be improved and to help, the idea here is that this will be beneficial to people in society.
Perfect. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Nope. Awesome. Thank you so much. Our last presenter is Dr. Christine Wickens. Dr. Wickens is a scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, and holds an appointment as Associate Professor at the University of Toronto. Through experimental studies, analysis of population-level survey data, and qualitative analysis of interviews and archival data, Dr. Wickens has contributed to a knowledge of topics including alcohol and drug impaired driving, driver anger and aggression, distracted driving, street racing, and the impact of mental health on driving. She has published close to 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and presents her work at conferences nationally and internationally. Dr. Wickens serves on the board of directors for CARSP and for the International Council on Alcohol, Drugs, and Traffic Safety.
Okay. So I think this presentation really follows this morning's presentation by Nick Ward quite well, because it kind of feeds into some of the material that he was presenting. How do I move this forward? No. How many PhDs does it take to get this? There we go. Okay. Okay. So perception of risk is something that Nick Ward talked about this morning. And perception of risk really is centrally entrenched in theories of health behavior change. In the context of road safety, both perceived risk of injury and perceived risk of apprehension by law enforcement play a central role in encouraging use of seatbelts and discouraging distracted driving and driving after drinking. When we look at driving under the influence of cannabis, or DUIC as it will be noted in my slides, recent research has shown that those who perceive this activity to be risky or dangerous are less likely to engage in the behavior. And likewise, though not as consistently demonstrated, are findings that those who have greater knowledge of legislation related to driving after cannabis use, or those who perceive greater likelihood of enforcement, are less likely to engage in the behavior. Now, in a previous analysis of the data set that we'll be discussing today, our team, this time led by Andre McDonald, examined agreement or disagreement with 3 risk-related statements, and I present them here. So number 1, driving under the influence of cannabis increases the risk of being involved in a motor vehicle collision. Number 2, it is safer to drive under the influence of cannabis than under the influence of alcohol. And number 3, the chances of getting caught by police for drinking and driving are higher than for using cannabis and driving. In looking at these 3 risk perceptions, we found an association between 2 of the statements and cannabis impaired driving. Specifically, past year cannabis users who disagreed that driving under the influence of cannabis increases collision risk, and those who agreed that cannabis impaired driving is safer than alcohol impaired driving had more than a 6-fold increase in their odds of engaging in driving under the influence of cannabis. So why does this matter? Driver education and public awareness campaigns are primary interventional strategies for cannabis impaired driving. But it's imperative for the effectiveness of these interventions that they are targeted at the appropriate audience with the most relevant content and type of appeal. So understanding risk perceptions of cannabis impaired drivers, cannabis impaired driving among cannabis users as a whole and among subgroups of cannabis users will positively inform our interventions. Now, one highly understudied subgroup among cannabis users are those who use for medical purposes, as opposed to those who do so for non-medical or recreational purposes. And in 2021, 14% of Canadians aged 16 plus years used cannabis for medical purposes, whereas 25% used cannabis for recreational purposes. And there are important distinctions between these 2 groups. Relative to recreational only users, medical cannabis users are older, they have lower income, they report poor health and mental health, they report more frequent use of and problems with cannabis, but less use of and problems with alcohol. They are less likely to use combustion and vaporization for cannabis administration, and more likely to use ingestion and topicals for administration. And interestingly, some of the factors that differentiate medical and recreational users have previously been identified as correlates of driving under the influence of cannabis. So for example, the odds of driving after cannabis use are greater among those who are experiencing mental health issues and those who report problems with the use of alcohol and cannabis. In terms of risk perceptions of cannabis use or driving under the influence of cannabis, we found only 2 studies that compared types of cannabis users. Cutler et al. 2018 conducted an online survey of cannabis users in the US aged 16 plus years and compared those using for recreational versus medical versus both purposes. But descriptive analyses found no differences in the percentage of participants who believed that driving under the influence of cannabis is safe. Wardell et al. Examined population level data from adolescents in Ontario and compared medical or dual purpose users to recreational only users. They found that medical or dual purpose users perceived use of the drug as less harmful than did recreational only users. So given what I perceived to be a clear dearth of data, the purpose of the current study was to explore perceived risk of cannabis impaired driving among recreational versus medical or dual purpose users. So the current sample was derived from the 2017 cycle of the CAMH monitor, which is a repeated cross-sectional telephone survey of Ontario adults aged 18 years and older. Respondents who reported past year use of cannabis and answered questions regarding DUIC risk perceptions were selected. The survey employs random digit dialing via computer-assisted telephone interviewing, which allows the survey to access both landline and cellular telephones. The response rate for this cycle of data was 35%, which is comparable to other recent surveys of alcohol and drug use conducted in Canada. Again, for our outcome measures, we used the same 3 DUIC risk perceptions in the previous paper that I had up on the screen earlier. Respondents were asked to rate their level of agreement with each statement on a 5-point scale, and responses for each statement were dichotomized to contrast high and low risk perception. The main predictor variable was purpose of cannabis use and was measured by 2 survey items. First, respondents were asked about past year cannabis use, and then they were asked if any of this use had been for managing a medical condition. So responses to those 2 items were then combined and recoded to create 2 groups: recreational cannabis use only and medical use or dual purpose use of cannabis. Now, I should note that a group dedicated to medical cannabis use only could not be created due to the limitations of the survey, as you can see here. But this really wasn't a major concern because grouping medical only cannabis users with dual purpose users has been common practice in the existing literature. And that's because we have many surveys that suggest that recreational cannabis use is in fact quite common among medical cannabis users. Other covariates in the analysis included sex, age, education, and morality. And given differences in use of alcohol and cannabis among user types, past year alcohol use frequency and cannabis use frequency were also included. As the 3 outcomes were highly prevalent, we opted to use modified Poisson regression and conducted 3 multivariable models. Individuals with missing data were excluded listwise, and all statistical analyses were corrected for the sampling design. Now, the results I'm going to present are brief, but as you will see, they lend themselves to a rather extensive discussion. Apologies in advance. So overall, 62.3% of cannabis users reported using for recreational purposes only, whereas 37.7% reported using for medical or dual purposes. In total, 14.9% of cannabis users reported disagreeing that cannabis impaired driving increases collision risk. 55.1% agreed that it is safer to drive under the influence of cannabis than under the influence of alcohol. And 74.9% agreed that the chances of getting caught by police for alcohol impaired driving are higher than for cannabis impaired driving. And here we have the multivariable models for each of the 3 risk perceptions. Adjusting for other covariates, medical or dual purpose users were 45% more likely than recreational only users to agree that cannabis impaired driving is safer than alcohol impaired driving. And significant differences between user types were not found for the other 2 risk perceptions. So let's take a look at what we now know about each of the 3 risk perceptions, starting with collision risk. An overwhelming majority, 77.2% of users, agreed that cannabis impaired driving increases collision risk. Now, this is encouraging. It tells us that education and awareness campaigns have been successful in communicating the driving-related impact of cannabis impairment. There were no significant differences between medical and non-medical users, suggesting any further efforts to alter this risk perception among the few who are unconvinced may target cannabis users generally, regardless of user type. But what we might want to consider in future research is refining that risk perception statement to assess how users feel about their own collision risk. We did an interview study a few years ago, and what we found is that cannabis users perceived an increase in collision risk amongst other cannabis users, particularly those who were less experienced, but they did not perceive an increase in their own collision risk. And that, of course, is what we would call a comparative optimism bias. And so I think it's probably something that we should be exploring in each type of cannabis user. What about the relative safety of cannabis versus alcohol impaired driving? Now, to be honest, when we look at the literature, the increase in collision risk associated with cannabis use is not as severe as the increase associated with alcohol. Yet, in the current study, only 55.1% of users correctly agreed that cannabis impaired driving is safer than alcohol impaired driving. Now, although the statement is true, we know from our previous study that those who correctly agree with this statement and therefore assign less risk to cannabis impaired driving are actually more likely to engage in the behavior. The current study found that medical or dual purpose users were more likely to agree with the statement, which is consistent with another of our findings that I presented last year, that medical or dual purpose users are more likely to drive under the influence of cannabis than recreational only users. So what can we do with all of this information? Well, the shift in public perception of drink driving as a high risk and socially unacceptable behavior was a key component in the battle against alcohol impaired driving. So for this reason, likening driving after cannabis to driving after alcohol, and specifically targeting medical or dual purpose users could be beneficial. So for example, campaigns could emphasize that like driving under the influence of alcohol, driving under the influence of cannabis is still a high risk behavior. We could highlight driving impairments that result from both alcohol and from cannabis, such as impaired lane control, as Robert pointed out. And we could stress that effects of cannabis are similar to those of blood alcohol concentrations, because that seems to capture more attention. And what about our last risk perception? Well, based on 2019 self-report data, the prevalence of alcohol impaired driving was 25% higher than that of cannabis impaired driving. Yet when we look at police reported data, the number of impaired driving incidents involving alcohol was 10 times higher than that of the number involving drugs. So these statistics kind of suggest that police disproportionately apprehend drivers who engage in alcohol versus cannabis impaired driving. Now, this fact was well recognized by our cannabis users. An overwhelming majority correctly agreed that the risk of being apprehended by police for alcohol impaired driving is higher than for cannabis impaired driving. And there was no significant difference between medical and non-medical users. What can we take from this? Well, breathalyzer technology revolutionized deterrence of drink driving, facilitating legislation and allowing for increased confidence that police could successfully detect and convict alcohol impaired drivers. Now, while detection of THC in oral fluid is currently approved in Canada, it's not really being extensively used, likely related to limitations of and lack of confidence in the technology. So perhaps improving the technology, but just as important, if not more important, communicating these improvements could augment deterrence and should be equally effective for medical and non-medical users. So we're getting close to the end, but it's always important to acknowledge potential limitations, and I've listed some of these here. First, the analyses may have been underpowered. We only had 1 year of data to work with. Second, study results are based on correlational self-report survey data, which cannot support cause and effect conclusions and may be subject to social desirability bias. And finally, we excluded non-English speakers and individuals with telephone access. Nonetheless, the study had several strengths. It addresses the intersection of two understudied topics using population-level data. It provides guidance for education and awareness campaigns in an environment where cannabis use may be increasing. And the results support further research examining the association between risk perceptions and cannabis-impaired driving by type of cannabis user. So I will stop there. Thank you all so very much for your kind attention, and I would welcome any questions you might have. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Christine. Are there any questions? Oh, got one right there.
Thank you for the presentation. Just two quick questions. First, for the medical use, was it like anxiety or sleep related issues considered like to be medicinal?
Yes, yeah. So the questions, I had them listed up on the slide. Because it's a phone survey, we're really, really restricted in how in-depth we can get. So any medical condition there, it could have been like glaucoma, it could have been anxiety, it could have been pain. So it's really very broad.
Okay, sounds good. And then just your thoughts on this. Like I was looking into this literature a while ago, and most studies will do recreational and medical, right? They kind of dichotomize it. But one thing I was looking at with youth, and this is kind of came out from findings from one of the previous studies I did, is a lot of youth will classify it as both, right? But in Canada, a young person can't really be prescribed cannabis, right? So they're not technically a medical user. So I'm curious if you've heard of anything else or maybe plan to investigate difference between recreational, licensed medical user and then like non-licensed medical use.
Yeah, we didn't look at that in this particular analysis. It doesn't seem to come out, it doesn't seem to have a huge impact on our analyses. Prior to legalization, the monitor included questions about cannabis use and a question about medical authorization to use. I believe that question is still in the monitor, but it doesn't really seem to have much of an impact. And so I think we see that people are very much self-medicating, but I would, before I can say that definitively, I know someone at CAMH has looked at it and reported on it, but my memory isn't fabulous. But my suspicion is that it's people are primarily self-medicating, but you still see a few people who do have medical authorization to use.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, right over here.
I think I might have missed a comment right at the end. I don't know if it addressed it or not, but was there any consideration for the manner in which they took the cannabis, smoking, edibles, stuff like that? And perhaps maybe, and I don't know if you're looking at expanding the study, but I think information that will be useful would be kind of that how they take it, whether they're just microdosing for medical purposes like anxiety or using edibles or high concentrates, which would be significantly different in the risk, right? So I think kind of expanding to ask those questions would give a lot more useful data as far as risk factors.
Thank you, and I completely agree with you. The CAMH monitor, as I said, it's a almost 30-minute telephone survey that really looks at mental health, a number of mental health and addiction issues. So it's always a battle to figure out what can you include and what can't you. So the questions that we've used here really focus on just use in general, but you're absolutely right. If we're going to be targeting public awareness and education campaigns, we need more information. So not only are you a medical or a recreational user, but are there differences in age, which Dr. Marshall was talking about earlier today? Are there differences in risk perceptions as a function of age? Are there differences in risk perception amongst those who maybe they're not willing to smoke cannabis, but they're really quite comfortable taking a cannabis gummy or cannabis edible, no problem. So I think you're right. It's really important to have more detailed information. Unfortunately, telephone surveys sometimes can be difficult because you can't get at that. Those epidemiological surveys really can't get at that type of detailed information. But certainly targeted surveys that you might have it in a university setting, for example, where students are sort of a captive audience. You can certainly ask more detailed questions there.
All right. Anyone else? Nope. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Christine. And thank you again to all of our presenters this session. So I believe we're on break now until 3 p.m. I think so. And then make sure you come back into this room. We have a great panel discussion on youth and road safety with Anne Marie, Robin, and a couple other folks. So see you all back here at 3.